So today I wanted to talk about the anti-trans legislation that's going on in the US and how that affects everyone, what some of them kind of mean, and just a couple different things on what we can do about it. Sorry if you hear crinkling in the background. My cat is playing with a bag and won't stop. So we'll move on from that. Now, we want to talk about why this matters. As we can see, as of April 29th, 2023, 528 bills have been proposed so far. We're only a little over a third of the way into the year, and we have 528 bills that have been proposed. Now, of course, not all of them have been approved, not all of them have been passed, a lot of them have been denied, which is really good. 50 of them have already been passed so far as of date, um, which means that theoretically speaking, if we keep going at this rate, we'll have about 150 anti trans bills passed by the end of this year and 1,500 plus anti trans bills that were proposed for this year, which is exponentially higher than in 2022, where we can see that 174 bills were proposed in 2022 and 144 bills were proposed in 2021. That number keeps going up and up. We have been on an uptick for anti trans bills being proposed for the past 4 years now. And if this doesn't stop, we're just going to keep seeing that happen for years to come. Now, with this also comes the rates of violence towards trans individuals, uh, and they increase each year. Every year on November 20th is Transgender Day of Remembrance in America, at least. I don't know about other countries. Um, and the number of transgender individuals who have unfortunately met an untimely death due to trans violence from other people just gets higher and higher. I honestly, for my own sake, had to stop tracking the number and keeping count because there was just so many people and so many young individuals, teenagers, older people, homeless people, like people of all different kinds of demographics just losing their lives just because they're trans. And now we're seeing these 528 bills, at least up to this point, that have been proposed in 2023 alone. So I have no doubt in my mind that we're going to have an uptick in trans violence this year as well. So this is why this matters, because people are dying. Now, to break down the bills a little bit, and I won't necessarily like touch on what they are specifically. Um, so we have bills that affect access for trans people. This includes, bathroom bills, locker rooms, sports. And I mean, I feel like that's been a thing that's been going on for a while now. This isn't a new thing, but there's quite a few of this, like it always has been. There's also a health category where it includes healthcare for people, for trans people specifically. They don't care about cisgender people at this point. We're targeting trans people. Well, they're targeting trans people, I should say. And this includes any sort of medical transition. So hormone replacement therapy, any surgeries, and a lot of this is just age restrictions, if I'm being honest. We also have like a miscellaneous category that I just put as other, and these are bills that don't necessarily fall into access or health. They're just things that exist to exist. Um, this includes the anti-drag bills, and this also applies to things such as don't say gay, things like that. Now, like I said, there is not a lot of the times there's not a clear definition on which bills fit into which category. They are separated for legislative purposes a lot. Um, but it's easier for us to see, like, okay, well, what are lawmakers targeting the most and what's their priority? Just so we can have an idea of what they're doing and maybe like come up with a plan on how we're going to combat that. So we're going to start off into the bills. And the first bill that I found, well, not that I found, I was just thinking of ones and going off of that and finding info. I found one that was specifically called the Given Name Act. I'm not certain which state called it this, but basically what it says is that, teachers, faculty, staff aren't required to use a student's chosen name, pronouns, or anything of the sort without the parent's consent. So basically, what that means is, say if Adam comes out at school, there's an Adam at school and he's not out at home. Any teacher could call home and be like, "Hey, do you approve of your child using the name Adam?" And that outs that student. And there's a possibility that they're out at home, and that's fine. But then there's also the possibility that they're not out at home, and that kind of I expect trans kids to be aware of what's going on and for them to be more cautious about that, but also they shouldn't have to be. They shouldn't have to worry about who they are and how they present themselves and having to be afraid of being themselves in public. And it really sucks that they can't do that at home if they can't. And I know for myself, school is a sanctuary where I could be myself whenever I wasn't 100% accepted. So it really sucks to see that schools are going to out students potentially. And even with that, if schools are going to forcefully out students, for this, there's a potential that that student could end up homeless because the parents kick them out. And I don't want to hear, oh, that never happens, because it happens a lot. Parents kick their children out for various reasons. It's not just for one specific thing. They kick them out because they're trans, because they're gay, because they end up pregnant, because they date someone that the parent doesn't necessarily like. Parents don't always be parents, and they will kick those trans kids out if they're not going to be safe at home. There's a very fair chance that we're going to see more homelessness in trans youth with this as well, potentially. Now, there's no statistics in this because it is relatively new-ish. It is only the beginning of the year, and these have just been for 2023 alone. So we haven't had a lot of time with them, but I could potentially see a lot more homeless trans youth because of this, potentially. Um, and I can speak for myself that, yeah, it's not always safe to be trans at home. Parents can be transphobic. Parents will kick your trans kids out. I've seen it with friends. I've seen it with multiple people. It's not like this doesn't happen, and it will happen. Um, Another thing is prohibiting gender transition. This is mostly focused on minors. This is like the focus on a lot of these trans bills tends to be minors, which for me personally feels a little bit odd that government officials are so focused on the biological sex of kids, but that's a whole different thing. I mean, it's not, but it is. So basically, it wouldn't allow minors from having any sort of medical transition. It doesn't matter if they've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria beforehand. They won't be allowed to medically transition. They won't be able to get hormones. They wouldn't be able to get any surgeries, even if they would have potentially qualified for them, which, mind you, I don't personally hear a lot about minors transitioning with surgeries. It does happen, but it's not super common. Like, I feel like a lot of government officials are making it out to be. It's not a very common thing, and now it's going to be less common because they're banning it in some states. Now, mind you, I hear this brought up, and I've had it brought up a couple times in discussion that some cisgender kids will end up on puberty blockers. Say, like, some girls, some cisgender girls start puberty too early, so they get put on hormone blockers, so they don't have to go through that so early, so they don't have to start puberty at age 7 or however young they are. That slows it down and that stops it, and they can prevent puberty from starting until a more what's considered appropriate age. Now, the laws have realized that this is an issue and a concern for them. So they found a way to skirt around it, and they're only banning it for people of the opposite sex. While it doesn't have this name in every single state, Nebraska has called this the Let Them Grow Act, which take that as you will. I don't know. It's an anti-trans bill. I obviously don't like it. Now there is one state at least that will prohibit medical gender transition for some adults, and how it would work, or how it does work, is unless they've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria before this bill was passed, it doesn't like they can't medically transition. They have to wait until they've been diagnosed with gender dysphoria, and then I believe there's a waiting period of at least 6 months. I'm not positive on it because I couldn't find it in the bill for some reason. I know I've heard people talk about it because I have some friends that are in states nearby and they have issues. Like, they have issues with this because they're concerned that it's going to happen to them. And I've heard of some people having it already happen to them, but some trans adults can't medically transition for like a certain amount of time, which is not the best because like they're adults, they can do whatever they want. So this is kind of the start of like, okay, well, we don't feel comfortable with having a transgender person medically transition. Like, this is stepping into the boundaries of adults, which is why I wanted to point it out because that's you're prohibiting adults from doing something. They can go buy alcohol and they can go legally like do all these things and potentially end their lives or other people's lives, but they can't medically transition. There's also the limitations on sports. And it's not just sports necessarily. This can include activities as well. It depends on what state and I guess on what school. So, a lot of states I'm seeing their sports have to be labeled as male, female, or co ed. Now, if someone wants to join a sport, they have to join the team based off of their biological sex. So, for example, you can have a cis girl and a trans girl that both want to join, I don't know, say soccer. They can't both be on the girls' sports team, even though they're both girls. And this also practically eliminates intersex and trans people in general from sports unless they're co ed. And I don't know how it is across the states. I don't know how it is for everybody, but around where I live and where I'm from, co ed was hardly ever a thing, if at all. And times change, that it could be a thing, it could be more common now. But especially in states that are having this, I don't necessarily see it happening where they have that space that could be welcoming for trans people potentially. And once again, it's the whole thing of why are government officials so worried about kids' genitals? And also, like I said, it includes activities as well. A trans girl probably wouldn't be allowed to join Girl Scouts. I I don't know that for sure, but that's my assumption from what I've read from the bills. Now, we also have book banning, which is not necessarily something new. It's been going on for a while, and it's not, this has been something that a lot of places have been doing, not even just by a bill, but just for themselves and in general. But I've seen a couple bills floating around on book banning, and it's not necessarily anti trans specifically, but they ban books that include graphic or explicit content by their standards, which more often than not includes all LGBTQ plus topics. So obviously that includes trans people. And it erases trans and queer authors. It erases queer stories from libraries, from bookstores, from wherever, which, I mean, these books are available online, but say you're a student going to school and you don't have a safe environment at home, the only access you have to anything queer related is at a school library. oops, you can't get it because the books have been banned, which I also find is mildly ironic because books are a form of education and we're banning them in an educational setting. We are banning a form of education in an educational institution. We also have been going on and on about the bathroom and locker room accessibility for a long time. It's been going on for years and it's never stopped and it's only getting worse, to be completely honest. And it basically says that, bathrooms and locker rooms have to be labeled as male or female, and only a person of that sex may enter. So a trans guy would have to go use the women's restroom, or a trans woman would have to use the men's restroom, no matter how well they pass as the gender they identify as. So you can have a very well passing cis woman be forced to use a men's restroom. And people painted out that trans people are these predators that are out to sexually violate people, and that's hardly ever the case. It is more likely for a cis person to sexually assault someone. It is more likely for that to happen. So really, all they're doing is putting trans people more at risk. Not only this, um, but it doesn't just affect trans people, I should point out. Because from the bills that I've looked at, they don't clarify about parents with children. They don't say that, oh, well, if you have a child, say I'm sorry, mom, but if you want to bring your son into the bathroom, you can't because he's not the same sex as you. You can't do that. There's nothing clarifying that, whereas the bill on medical transition and barring puberty blockers for trans individuals and having that available for cis people only and not for trans people. There's no clarification from what I've found in a couple of the bills that I've looked at. Now, I'm not saying that this is for every state because I'm assuming every state is different, but so far I have not seen that in the bills that I've seen from states. I'm not positive which states they were because I tried not to look into it too much. I was just reading the information and trying to process that because it is wordy and it is a lot. But it doesn't clarify that. So if anybody enforces this at all, which I doubt they will if it's a parent and a kid, but if they were to enforce it and enforce it properly, it would affect cisgender people with kids of the opposite sex. It's going to affect everybody. And I don't know if everybody realizes this. Also, I should note that there was a bill similar to this in Iowa. But as far as I could tell, it's only in effect in elementary and secondary schools for some reason. And maybe I could have been reading it wrong, but they made very sure to point out that this applies to you if it's in an elementary or secondary school building. And it wasn't very clear on if it was for everywhere. So I'm not sure. I'm just not sure about that one, to be completely honest. I thought it was weird. Maybe I was probably reading it wrong. It's wordy. I don't know much about laws, but I can read. Now, we have the anti-drag laws as well. And these aren't explicitly transphobic, but they can pertain to trans individuals because they state that anybody that's seen in public as performing as the opposite sex is an offensive crime. Trans people could be arrested for it, drag performers could be arrested for it. It doesn't necessarily target trans people, but they could skew it in that way if they so desire to. It doesn't specifically say that trans people are excluded. Now, it's important to bring up the anti-drag bill in general because drag is important to the queer community. From my experience and from what I've seen, drag is very prevalent and very prominent in the queer community. Anybody can do it. It's open to anybody. Does like you can be cishet and do drag, you can be trans and do drag. Drag isn't discriminatory. It can go for anybody. And honestly, from how I've been looking at it through all these trans bills, this is one of the first bills I think, in my opinion, that could potentially be like, okay, well, we're getting rid of the trans people. Let's get rid of the rest of the queer community. And I don't want to say this to make people be in fear, but I want people to be aware that it could potentially go that way if they see that it's possible to do. A lot of their concerns around drag are also mostly that it's not suitable for children and that it's exposing children to gender and sexuality too early, and it's too promiscuous for children. But we see time and time again that, when we have drag story hours, drag performers aren't going dressed inappropriately if they're going to be reading to kids. Drag performers are performers. They know how to act. They know their audience and they know who they're reading to. They're going to dress accordingly. They know better. They're adults. They know better. They have the common sense. So, honestly, like the legislation is so uneducated on these topics and don't really see it. And they just, how I see it, they just want to spew hate and do anything they can do to prevent queer people from existing, pretty much. Now, last but not least, this bill that I found, and I wanted to point it out so specifically, and it's relevant to multiple states, but it was in, I believe, I want to say it was in Indiana. It was in the state of Indiana. Um, and just the title of it is it's so wonderful. It's called Education Matters. Okay, so Education Matters is a bill that I believe, like I said, I'm not positive. I'm pretty sure it was Indiana. They say that human sexuality is prohibited to be instructed to students from pre-K through third grade. Now, they did state that staff and faculty, like people are allowed to answer questions if it's asked. It's little kids, they're going to ask questions. It's very possible. Um, but educators aren't allowed to talk about human sexuality to children up through third grade. And also, with that, going back to another bill earlier, if a student has a new name or pronouns or anything of the sort, um, and the school finds out, it has to be reported to a guardian. And like I said before, it will out the students into a potentially dangerous environment, potentially. Now, I would like to mention that they specifically said human sexuality. They didn't say, oh, you can't teach LGBTQ topics. It's human sexuality specifically. Now, I highly doubt they really mean all human sexuality because that would include heterosexuality. And I would assume that since they're barring transgender education, they would bar cisgender education if they're going to take this literally, but I know they're not because they are how they are and enforcement is how it is. Um, I highly doubt that they will enforce all human sexuality to be banned. I'm sure, like, if they have a Disney day, they'll throw on a Disney movie that's very explicitly heterosexual. It wouldn't shock me. They won't enforce it for heterosexual people, for cisgender people, because that's not what they mean, and that's probably implied, like it is in the Constitution with everything pretty much. Like all of our laws are just so implied, but not. And it really comes down to enforcement, and it's going to be enforced against the queer community with these bills, is what I'm assuming. Now, I mean, because we even see, like, if you go into a kids section for shirts, they'll have shirts like Chicks Dig Me. They'll have, like, oh, Heartbreaker, or, like all the stereotypical straight things. And that's okay. But once any kid say if any kid's talking about their two gay uncles, that's a problem. That's going to be the problem. Also, I would just really like to point out the irony in Education Matters, because really, what education are they getting on any of these topics? And like, this is a whole sector of education. We have queer studies in many universities. Queerness is a study, and schools are a place where you study, yet we're banning a piece of education and also a piece of educators, because Not all educators are cishet. We have plenty of queer educators that this is also going to affect because if there's any educator that's queer for pre-K through 3rd grade or for any grade for that matter if it gets that far, they won't be able to talk about their families. They won't be able to talk about themselves if it's queer, but their colleagues can do the same thing because they're cisgender and they're heterosexual and it's fine, which is really hypocritical and also doesn't really help the teacher shortage that we're having in America. Now, obviously, like I've been saying, this affects everyone in many ways. For trans people, obviously, this is targeting, all these are targeting trans people pretty much. Um, and I'm sure that all these bills and laws will just encourage people to be more transphobic and it'll be like a comforting thing. They'll be like, "Oh, well, the government's being transphobic, so we can. Why couldn't we be transphobic? Because they're enabling it, so we can." And with all of the bans on medical transition and not being able to be out at school, I would not be shocked if we saw an increase in suicidality in trans individuals, especially in young trans individuals. The suicide rate for trans people and trans kids is a lot higher than their cisgender peers, and it's only going to get worse with these. Like I've said before, it'll force them out of the closet with their parents if they do come out at school and they're forced to have that reported home. And it's very well going to cause trauma. I hear a lot of government officials talking about how, oh, well, these people detransitioned, it caused trauma. But not letting someone transition can also cause trauma. It can also cause stress. There's been studies that have shown that it causes stress and trauma and anxiety and suicidality and depression. There's studies that support trans people, and this is just tearing them down and destroying that. And like I've mentioned briefly a couple times, it affects cisgender people too. Um, it'll affect cis parents of trans kids because their trans kids may commit suicide. They may be more likely to commit suicide because of these bills, especially if they're affecting them. I know that's affecting everybody's mental state across the states, even if these bills aren't applying to us, because the trans community, especially in America, well, specifically in America, is thinking, okay, well, when's our state? What's going to happen if it comes here? What would we do if we had a bill that's in this state? Or, they have friends in other states and they're like, oh, well, how am I supposed to support my friends in other states? Cis people can have family that are trans in these states, and that affects them. They could lose their family members. And as I've said, bathroom bills might affect parents with kids. We don't know, and it probably won't be enforced. But if it is, it would affect them. And drag performers can be cis. A lot of the times they are, sometimes they aren't. It'll affect them because they have bills specifically against them. And it'll even potentially affect cis people who are expressing themselves non traditionally to their gender. So, for an example, a butch lesbian might stereotypically dress more masculine, and that could go against the bill, technically, if they really wanted to. And as I've stated before, it affects educators. It affects the fact of, okay, well, now I have to out this kid to their parents potentially. I have to deal with the stress of my colleagues not calling my student by their correct name or pronouns. I have to deal with not being able to talk about my family or my wife or my spouse or whoever. Potentially, this could affect any trans educators or any queer educators from educating pre-K through 3rd grade, like that one bill has said. It can affect educators, and like I've said, we're experiencing a teacher shortage across the country. So it's not really going to help that. There are a couple things that can be done though. So one of the things that first comes to mind is attending protests. If there are protests that are being held in your area against these bills, attend them. Take friends with you or find friends to take you if you don't have a method of transportation. But you want to make sure that you follow basic safety rules for protests. There's plenty of resources online that you can find, and you never know what the environment could be like. You don't know how busy the protest could be. You don't know how many people are going to be there. You don't know what kind of enforcement's going to be there. So if you do attend protests, the trans community thanks you, but also please be safe. And not everybody is built for protests. Not everybody can do them. So do them at your own risk. But they can help and they can work. You can also voice your opposition. There's so many ways to contact your representatives and your government officials and your lawmakers and the such. If you don't know who they are, I suggest you Google them and you find out who they are. And if you're really invested in this, keep track of what they're doing. I found a lot with these bills that they're largely Republicans that are trying to push these bills through, creating them, coming up with them, bringing them up, getting them through. I don't think, well, I was looking through all of the bills, I don't think I saw one Democratic lawmaker. And like I saw one Democrat lawmaker that was pushing for these bills to be passed. It was majority Republicans. I am not positive. I think there's one person that wasn't either a Republican or Democrat. I'm not sure which they were, but it's very largely Republican. So know who your officials are. You can send them emails and letters or make phone calls. They have their contact information. A lot of times, websites will have ways to get a hold of them and voice your concerns. Tell them that you don't support their transphobia. Tell them, even if, they're on your side, tell them that, yeah, hey, this isn't going to fly and you better not. Well, don't be threatening about it, of course, especially if they're on your side. But let them know, let your lawmakers know that you won't support this. And there's people here that won't support it, and they're supposed to be representing you. They're not there for their opinion, they are there for you. They are there to represent you, and they're not going to know what their community wants unless we tell them. So tell your lawmakers what you want. Tell them that their transphobia will not be supported. They will not be tolerated. And obviously, the least you could do is support the people that are affected. It affects pretty much everybody at this point. Largely, it affects the trans community. So if you know anybody who's trans, support them. If you know any queer person, support them because it'll likely affect them too. Just believe trans people when they say who they are. Listen to their stories, read about them, consume their work. If you know of a trans artist, go to art galleries with trans people. Go listen to music from trans people. Go read stories written by trans people. Go listen to trans people talk. Go support trans people because they need it. The trans community in America needs all the help they can get. The trans community in general needs all the help they can get. We need all the support we can get. But especially in America, with everything that's happening, they need every last bit of support and love. And it'll be appreciated because it's really disheartening to be a trans person in America right now. It's really scary. And I know of a lot of people who have considered detransitioning and just going back into the closet and having mental breakdowns over it because that's not who they are. But for their safety, they have to do this, they feel. And it's not right that we're forcing this on trans people. It's not fair that we're forcing any of this on anybody. And like I've said numerous times, it's not going to only affect trans people. This affects everyone, whether you want to believe it or not. And lastly, I'd like to end on a quote by someone that I'm assuming so many people know of by now. And if you don't know of her, go Google her, go look her up, go follow her because she is doing her best. And my God, she needs support. She's a wonderful human being, and she's a representative. I'm sure we know who I'm talking about. Representative Zoe Zephyr. We will not be complicit in our eradication. Thank you.